So it's a fascinating book, and you take these four presidents in chronological order, and you take them through three basic questions about leadership. Where does the ambition come from? Moments of adversity, what they learned from that, and then turning points, really, that made them great leaders. Let's take that and start with ambition. Certainly, Abraham Lincoln had driving ambition, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, and Lyndon Baines Johnson. President Trump is now in the White House. He has ambition. I don't think there's any question about that.
Yeah, the question about ambition, I think, is that, first of all, it's the drive for success. You can't be successful without ambition, which means a fierce will to do everything you can and work hard to get ahead in the world. And for Abraham Lincoln, it was to get out of that world that he had come from. For Teddy Roosevelt, at first, it was just adventure, and he wanted to enjoy politics. But then suddenly his ambition got connected to making lives better for other people. For FDR, it took the polio to make it self-ambition to something bigger. And LBJ, it took a massive heart attack to make that. So I think the question for President Trump now is, he's in this great, powerful office, and how do you transform that ambition for the self, which got him into incredible success in the business world, into an expansive understanding of what he wants to do for the people of the country. He's got his base, and whether he can expand that base, all my other guys were able to do that. They had a certain base when they came in, but then they wanted to make it bigger.
It's interesting. It didn't necessarily correlate in any way with whether you were poor or whether you were comfortable. Because Abraham Lincoln, I didn't understand until I read in your book how poor he really was. I mean, it was extraordinary. I mean, when his father comes back with his new stepmother, they didn't even have a door on the house, for goodness sakes.
I know, and he's left alone for months at a time. No, privilege can stunt ambition as well as develop ambition. So you have to give that to President Trump, that his ambition wasn't stunted by the fact that he already had the wealth. Neither was FDR's, neither was Teddy Roosevelt's. So it depends on what's inside a person. Like FDR, only when he went out on the barnstorming for the first time as a campaigning, he realized this is what he led a really insulated life. He said, this is what I want to be. The philosopher William James says there's a moment in all of our lives when you say to yourself, this is the real me. So it really interests me. I mean, I've read about Howard Schultz saying that he wanted to get away from that world that he was living in New York, and that's what created his ambition, much like, I think, Abraham Lincoln. So there's a correlation between people in business, people, university presidents, wherever that desire to lead comes from. I think it's the same in human nature.
And it's not enough to be ambitious. One of the things we learn in your book is there has to be at least a moment, not more than one moment, but a moment that really sets you back. We all have those moments in life, but these people reacted in a way different from the way many of us might.
Yeah, the leadership literature in business especially, because I've read a lot of those business leadership books, they argue that when you go through a crucible, you go through a tough time, if you can emerge from it with wisdom and self-reflection, you're a better leader. Ernest Hemingway said, everyone is broken by life, but afterwards some people are stronger in the broken places. Lincoln was in a near suicidal depression. He was so sad that they took all knives and razors and scissors from his room. His gap between his big ambitions and where he was seemed too big to bridge. But then his friend comes to his side and said, you must rally or you'll die. And he said, I know that, and I'd just as soon die now, but I've not yet accomplished anything to make any human being remember that I lived. He's amazing.
So self-reflection is not something we always associate with great leadership. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it at the same time. I mean, I'm interested particularly in, like, Lyndon Johnson, whom you knew well, worked with in the White House, worked with him back on the ranch. Was he self-reflective? Because I never thought of him as being that way.
He certainly wasn't most of his life, up until that point when he had this massive heart attack. And suddenly he asked himself, what if I died now? What would I be remembered for? And then he went for civil rights in the Senate, and then for civil rights when he got into the presidency. So those moments really do make a difference. There's no question with FDR. When that polio occurred, he emerged more warm-hearted, more able to connect to other people to whom fate had dealt an unkind hand. So the interesting thing to me about President Trump is he's been through losses. I mean, he's had bankruptcies. And yet, when he talks about it, he'll say the most important temperament that he has to offer is that he's always, always won. And you wonder, hopefully, he has reflected on those. Maybe he doesn't publicly want to talk about that or acknowledge, that he had difficult times. But you become a larger person when you can learn from those.
Certainly, there doesn't seem to be a lot of public evidence that President Trump, at least heretofore, has become very self-reflective. In fact, he almost prides himself in not being, I think.
Yeah, something's happening, I think, for people in public these days where they don't think that acknowledging errors is a good thing. They think it's a sign of weakness. I mean, my guys were able to acknowledge that they learned from their mistakes. You grow that way. Teddy Roosevelt, when he first got into the state legislature, had a swelled head because he was pounding the desk. He was yelling at everybody. And then he said, I rose like a rocket and I came down like a rocket. And I learned to moderate my language. And he was proud of being able to talk that way. But maybe today, in today's world, you don't feel that way.
So we have ambition, we have a setback, or a crucible, as you call it. But you also have to have the opportunity. There has to be some really big task set in front of you. We had 4 people here with very different tasks. But can you be a great leader without some great challenge like that?
It's harder to mobilize the country, or it's harder to really make a big difference in a company, perhaps, if you don't have a great challenge and you just have things going along like this. But you have to have the right temperament for that moment. I don't think these guys could have been interchangeable. I mean, Lincoln was perfect for the Civil War. He had the patience and the perseverance. He was merciless, but he was merciful. FDR was perfect for coming to a paralysis in the economy. He'd gone through his own paralysis, and he had that optimism and confidence. LBJ had the legislative wizardry for the Congress and getting the bills through the Congress. If you put any other leader in those situations, Buchanan was before Lincoln, he fails. He's one of the worst. So it's not a matter of just having the crisis. You have to have the temperament for it. That's the question. Does the man make the times, or the times make the man?
Well, and even as we watch the news today, and there's nothing like the Civil War or Pearl Harbor or a Great Depression, just today, President Trump has perhaps his first great international crisis with the situation with Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Mr. Khashoggi. So how should we be looking at that to see how he is evolving as a leader in dealing with something like that?
Well, I think the most important thing that I learned, and I did a crisis management case study of Teddy Roosevelt handling the coal strike. First, you have to focus single-handedly on that crisis. You really should be cutting everything out so that you get a crisis management team around you and that you're able to bring the best thought. This is a big deal, what's happening now. It'll affect our relations with Saudi Arabia, the fact that a journalist has been killed, and that we've really seen it in a way because we saw him going in there and coming out. Many people can imagine what might have happened to him. Pictures can make a difference sometimes in whether you feel viscerally something. And it's going to affect a lot of businesses who are already taking leadership right now to cut themselves out of conferences or investments in Saudi Arabia. It could be a big turning point in the Middle East. And he's already on record and having said certain things. He may have to evolve in what he's thinking. So if I were him, I'd just be thinking about this right now and not meeting with extra people. I mean, even during the time when that hurricane came and he met with Kanye West, you would have hoped he was just focusing on the hurricane. So hopefully that's what you learn when you're in office. You have to figure this out.
Let's talk about a couple of things that are in your book but aren't the main themes of your book. Intelligence. How important is raw intelligence? Because actually the 4 people you cover here have very different kinds of intelligence.
Right. I think that's right. They said about FDR that he had a first-rate temperament but a second-rate intelligence, but he knew how to problem solve. He knew also what intelligence also requires, I think, in a leader is knowing how to manage yourself and knowing when you need time to think, when you need time to relax. All of my guys were able to amazingly take time off. We think we're so busy, we can't possibly relax. Lincoln went to the theater 100 times during the Civil War. He said when the lights came down, he could imagine himself could imagine himself back in the War of the Roses in Shakespeare's time, and he could relax. FDR had a cocktail party every night in the White House during World War II because he wanted to make a point that you can't talk about the war. We can only talk about gossip or books. Those are the kind of things I think that are a different kind of intelligence. It's knowing yourself and knowing how to make sure your energy doesn't get depleted.
Do we necessarily know we have a great leader when we did? I mean, if you take Abraham Lincoln, for example, we didn't have public opinion polls. If you took a poll in 1863 or even 1864, I'm not sure he would have scored so well.
The people around him would have known, his inner team, the team he built of his rivals famously. They understood within short order. They thought they were all better than him in the beginning, but they saw they were in the presence of somebody pretty special. But the country as a whole, even the Union as a whole, didn't know until a real period of time. And it finally settled in, I think, after the war was won and he died. And then people started writing memoirs and diaries came out and letters, and you realized what an extraordinary leader he'd been through all the difficulty.
And finally, what about integrity? I mean, we always say we want integrity, but how much integrity do we want in a president or in a real leader? Because sometimes they have to make decisions on the margin. They have to cut corners sometimes to get to where they need to get to?
I think there's no question that sometimes the means have to be difficult to get the ends, but I think in the end, character and integrity is the most important thing. When Tolstoy was once asked about why Lincoln was so well remembered, he said it was his character and the moral fiber of his being in the end. And I think that's true of all of us. But you're right, being a great character doesn't mean you're going to have to cut deals, you're going to have to do things that are difficult. Lincoln was all the way doing that to get the 13th Amendment, and yet he's got the character we remember.